Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Church World Service webinar series, Caring in Crisis Extended Study Sessions. I'm your host, Reverend Mary Hughes with Crisis Care Ministries, and we're so glad that you've joined us today. You know, we've had a wonderful series thinking about embracing God's future without forgetting the past. It's difficult to believe we've come to our final regular session. It seems we just got started, and I think we have a couple of new things for Bishop Mike to write in his next book based upon some of our conversations. So we're so glad that you've been joining us. A few reminders before we begin. You can find all things webinar, links to the videos from recorded sessions, information about Bishop Mike, Girlinghouse, links to his book, as well as the ability to connect with Heather Wilson about attendance certificates. All of that can be found at crisiscareministries.net. Just click on the webinar hub at the top of the page. And at the webinar hub, you can also scroll down to the bottom and find resources from previous series that we've held. Throughout the webinar today, please feel free to type questions or comments in the question box. Watch your email for information about attendance certificates. You'll be receiving those from Heather Wilson. And again, you can find her email address at the webinar hub as well as on the slide rotations here. Now, although we have reached our final regular session, we are really excited about next week, because next week, Bishop Mike has agreed to come for a bonus session. That's February 14th, next Tuesday, at this same time. We'll be gathering in a Zoom meeting format. We'll turn the cameras on, have the mics ready to go, and just have a wonderful time together with an informal conversation, and that video will not be recorded. And so, once again, we welcome Bishop Michael Girlinghouse, the Bishop of the Arkansas-Oklahoma Synod of the Evangelical Church in America. Thank you, Bishop Mike.
Thank you. I need to share my screen here. Here we go. And there it is. Good morning, or whatever time it is, wherever you happen to be on this day. Good to be back with you this week to wrap up our conversation or these presentations around embracing God's future without forgetting the past. I am looking forward to the informal conversation next week when we can have some interaction, a little bit more conversation, so I can learn from you and we can dig deeper into some things that have jumped out for you during our time together. Over these past weeks, we have started looking at the various tasks that we need to work through as we grieve, not only as individuals, but more specifically as communities of faith. We've talked about the grief process itself. We've talked about the importance of working through the pain of our sense of loss as both as individuals, but also as communities of faith. Last week, we began to talk a little bit about, as we do that work, as we work on those tasks of accepting the losses, of naming them, of telling the stories about our past, moving from yearning to a more nostalgic way of thinking about the past, that we begin to adapt to the changed realities we face within our communities of faith. We want to get into that a little bit further today and talk about remembering forward. How do we take and draw strength from the past in that kind of nostalgic way we talked about a week ago and begin to apply that to taking those first steps into God's future? So what is that process and what are some of the tools that we can use? We're going to talk about change and what is necessary for change as we come out of the most intense times of our grief and begin to walk forward and move forward to take up life again. So that's where we're going today. So today's going to be less about grief and more about how do we begin to walk with the faith community, our faith community, as that grief becomes part of us, as we begin to move the past from a living thing into one of memory and begin to feel that energy coming back after working through a loss. So here we go. I need to pick up my screen there. As we've been doing, I want to start with a quote and a question for you to kind of chew on while we're going through our conversation today. Alan Roxenberg, who's quoted in Mark Law Branson's book, on appreciative inquiry, which they'll say more about in a little bit here, says this: transformation and innovation come not from programs presented by leaders, but from the myriad ways ordinary people come together in dialogue. And we've talked a lot about the importance of dialogue, of narrative, of storytelling, as we work through our grief, as we come to terms with what we've lost, as we move from yearning into nostalgic ways of thinking about our past. And Roxenberg and others lift up the fact that we are not going to change our faith communities by coming up with the perfect program, the perfect thing that will change it all and make it all back the way it used to be, because we said used to be can't be reclaimed anyway. So it's not that we can program our way out of our grief any more than we can replace somebody who has died, recreate a job that we valued, or any of the other things that we lose over the course of our lives. But in fact, it's something we do together, particularly in faith communities. As we come together, we talk together, we dream together, we imagine together, and we take steps together, supporting and encouraging one another. So this is what I want you to think about a little bit. Think about a time in your organization that you kind of consider a high point experience, a time when you personally felt the most engaged and felt the most alive and vibrant in your faith community. If you can't think of one of those, I hope you can. But if you can't think of one of those, think about just in your life in general, some high point experience when you just, everything was kind of clicking for you. And I hope you can all find one of those memories and pull it back up. So as you think about that, why don't you ask yourself, what were those core factors that gave life to your organization and give life to your organization now when it truly is at its best? One of my previous associates in the bishop's office used to like to go into congregations and say, I want to help you to be the best version of yourself right now. And I think that's such a brilliant way of thinking. How can we help congregations, other faith communities, be the best version of themselves as they work through their losses, as they begin to adapt to the changed realities that they face? So what are those kind of core things that make your organization its best? And that's what we're going to talk about. How do we mine those things, pull those things out, and tell the stories about those things in such a way that we can move forward into God's future? So let's talk about embracing God's future without forgetting the past. I love this butterfly picture. To me, it's just a wonderful sign of new life. I don't even remember where I took it anymore. I think it was at a butterfly garden somewhere. Anyway, so we know a faith community is beginning to work on this task of embracing God's future, of embracing the future, of stepping into tomorrow instead of being focused on yesterday, when they begin to see the past as a resource. Rather than wanting to recreate the past, begin to say, we can tap that past, we can begin to draw strength from that past for the sake of the future. So we have a sense of continuity, that the discontinuity of the loss has begun to heal. And remember, these tasks are never done in order, they come and they go. But when you start to more and more see that past as something you can carry with you into the future as a resource and a guide, you're beginning to be ready to embrace that future as it comes. Communities are ready to embrace God's future when they begin to become a learning community. By learning community, I mean a community that is open to exploring new ideas, to kicking ideas around, to experimenting, to trying stuff, to study, to look for resources, to read a book together. Sometimes it's just little stuff, sometimes it's bigger stuff, but that learning and growing becomes on the front edge of what the community is doing together, rather than something that's done in a tangential way. When you begin to feel some renewed energy for ministry, that's a sign that we're ready to start stepping into God's future. And that, again, might start small, little signs of energy around the edges of the community, people starting to engage in new ways. I was just talking to somebody the other day about their community, and 22 was kind of a rough year for them. as they were coming out of the COVID pandemic, as people weren't returning to worship in the way that they had hoped. And of course, all the accompanying struggles with declining finances, difficulty recruiting leaders. And they had just had their annual meeting, and they said, we actually had people volunteer for stuff. I don't know if they'll follow through, but they're volunteering for stuff. I've been trying for 2 years to recruit people to what we call our candidacy committee, and last week I had 5 people say yes to me. I was so excited. There's some energy, some new energy starting to bubble up, just in little ways, small ways. I was really excited at our meeting on Saturday that everybody that I recruited showed up, because we have recruited people and they haven't showed up, just didn't have the energy for it, and started to engage. So I'm beginning to see signs in my own ministry, but also I'm hearing about this in some of our congregations, that people are starting to re-engage. There's some renewed energy there as we step into 2023. Others are still not so much in that place. Faith communities are ready to embrace God's future when they show a willingness to be surprised. Rather than to see surprises as setbacks or crushing or just another experience of loss, they begin to see surprises of things they didn't expect as opportunities, as new blessings, as new doors opening. And that takes some time. That takes some time to get to that place, especially if the congregation or the faith community has never even been in that place to start with. But I think as we begin to tap our past in that nostalgic kind of way, because we know there's an anchor there, there's some continuity, we can handle those surprises a lot more creatively. And a community of faith is ready to embrace God's future when it can begin to see and tell the story of its strengths as well as of its losses, and then build on those strengths. And we'll talk a lot more about building on strengths here in a moment. So one of the questions that we can do to start getting at those strengths, at those core values, at those things that make our congregation move and in a positive way, both in the past and in the present, are discovering what gives that community of faith life, to start looking at what is going well. I mean, unless your community of faith is a total train wreck, my guess is something's going well. And it may be something very small. I remember when I was in mediation training with Lombard Mennonite Peace Fellowship, which is an amazing program, one of the best things I've ever done in terms of continuing education. I remember we were talking about mediation and trying to bring sides together in the midst of a conflict, and our instructor said, you know, sometimes the only thing you can do with 2 parties that are in conflict is get them to agree to talk again. That's it. They may not agree on anything else, but if they're willing to keep talking, that's a sign that something's going right. And so it can be something that small, just to say, what's going well? People are here. You know, maybe not as many as before, but we have a few people. Maybe we have 1 or 2 people that want to try something. Let's water that and see where it goes. The questions we can ask ourselves as we think about what is going well is, what actually has persisted in the life of your faith community through this time of COVID, through this time of dramatic change, of decline, of aging, of whatever it is in terms of the losses that you're experiencing. What is it that has not been lost? What's still there? What's still good at the core? What is at the center of your identity that hasn't been lost in the course of facing changes? And that may, again, take a little bit of time to get at, but that happens again in that sense of dialogue, of storytelling, of talking to one another, of listening to one another. And what feels good right now? If there's anything, hopefully something, what makes you happy? And how do you begin to nurture that, water that, encourage that as you begin to come to this new place as you work through your losses and your sense of grief? So, appreciative inquiry talks about identifying the positive core. What is the positive core at the center of your community of faith, or of any group you're working with, of your family, of where you work, a business? And this is a wonderful list of things that can kind of get you thinking. Now, no organization is probably going to have all of these things, maybe a few of them, and it begins to identify some of the places where you can begin to grow, where you can begin to water, you can begin to support and encourage. And so you can think about achievements. Have you achieved anything in the last couple of years, even if it's a little thing? What kind of opportunities it presented? This comes out of the business world, so you have to translate some of these. Do you have any product strengths? I would say that within the communities I serve, our product strength is the gospel, the good news of God's love and grace, some of the work we do around justice issues. Those are strengths. And even I tell our little congregations this all the time, even our smallest congregations are in some way engaged in service in their communities. Even our congregations that have just maybe 8 or 10 people in worship are in some way doing something in their community, collecting food for a food pantry. Those are things that can be nurtured and grown on. Technical assets. Have you innovated anything that you've tried new, even if it hasn't worked? And if you tried stuff that's new and it hasn't worked, what did we learn from that? New thoughts, best faith community practices. Like I said, this list has to be translated a little bit. Positive emotions, so on and so forth. You've probably skimmed through this whole list already by the time I've gone through. I'm not going to go through all of them. But what are those things, those positive things that lie at the center of the community as you think about who you are and what you are in this present time? Remember, I think it was 2 times ago, we talked about the difference between focusing on loss and focusing on restoration. This is really where you start to move from more loss-oriented conversation to more restorative conversations. How do we rebuild? I remember when we had a huge church fire when I was serving in Nebraska. Burnt the church to the ground, and all that really remained was the foundation. And that became, in a certain way, a metaphor for that congregation. Even though everything else had burned, all my youth ministry stuff burned, which was a huge loss in addition to the massive losses of lots of other things. But how do we identify the foundation that's still there that can be rebuilt upon? Now, we ultimately merged with another congregation and moved into their facility, but we sold what was left of our building to another congregation, and they rebuilt a church on that foundation. Even as we were rebuilding our ministry in a different location. So how do you define that foundation, that core that's still there even after significant loss that can be built upon? So we want to talk a little bit about making change. Once we start to identify that positive core, how is it that we begin to move a congregation to do this work of building? And again, I steal a lot from the business community. My first congregation was full of people in the business world, and I learned a lot from them. Like I say, a good portion of it needs to be translated, but I think it can be translated into the work of faith communities and churches. So the change formula was originally developed in, I think, the 1950s or 60s as a fairly simple way to talk about how do we and what is necessary for change to happen in an organization. And it's very translatable into faith communities. So this is the formula. I was just a meeting the other day, we were talking about our gifts and skills and some of our history, and I think about 2/3 of us on the call said that we all hated math. There was one person who said, math is my thing, and we said, thank God for you, because those of us that are math impaired need you. So I was presenting this somewhere, and I don't even remember what I said, but one of the women on the call, on the meeting was a math teacher, and she said, corrected me in terms of my understanding of how multiplication works. Anyway, those of us that remember 3rd grade or 4th grade or where we learn how to multiply understand how multiplication works. If any of the variables in a multiplication problem is 0, it zeroes out the whole thing, which is why this is not cumulative with plus signs, but multiplication signs. So you need all 4 of these qualities. And then you have your greater than, less than symbol there. All of those things multiplied together need to be stronger than the resistance in the community. So let's take a look at each one of these in turn. The first one is D. In the original model, it was for dissatisfaction with the status quo, dissatisfaction in more contemporary conversations. A lot of change formula people who teach this stuff talk about it as a desire for change. I think it'd be either or. Something in the community has to be aware of the fact that there's a need for change. Dissatisfaction, particularly in the context of talking about grief and loss, often comes from that discontinuity that the loss creates. We understand that something has to change because we are no longer connected with our past. We no longer see that yearning is going to work. We're not going to recreate the past, but we still know that something's broken and needs to be addressed. And so we're dissatisfied with something, and we know that something has to change. Or we can see opportunities, particularly as we start to adapt to the change realities. We can generate a true and sincere desire for something new. We can say, oh, I'm so excited about maybe trying this or trying that. And we can see those opportunities. But that has to be there. If everybody is totally satisfied and happy with the status quo, change will not happen ever. It just won't. Remember when I was first bishop, we did a bunch of data collection surveying in our synod. And I had a little bit of a brain lock because when the results came back, our congregations were very clear on how much they liked their churches. They just loved their churches. And it was positive. They were good places. They felt fed, nurtured, and supported and cared for in their congregations. On the other hand, there was an overwhelming sense that they needed to do something different, that something needed to change. And I was talking to the person who was helping us do this surveying work, and they said, as long as they are that happy with who they are now, they will never become something else. Even though they can articulate the fact that they would like to see change, without that sense of some dissatisfaction somewhere in that mix, change is going to be really, really hard. The second is V for vision. The vision of a positive possibility. It's more than just absence of pain, but a vision that draws us forward of something positive that could come if you make change, a vision that can draw you into that new thing. And that's part of what happens when we grieve, when we deal with loss, is our vision becomes very myopic. It becomes very blurry. It's really hard to even imagine how we can step into what's next. I've heard, I don't know how many grieving people have said, I'm just trying to get through the day. I can't think about tomorrow. I can't think about next week. Can't think about 6 months from now. I am so brokenhearted from this loss that I've experienced. I just can't get through. I just need to get through today. But later on, as they work through the grief process, they begin to get a little bit longer, a little bit longer, a little bit longer vision that draws them forward. I remember that after my dad died, my mom just had a really, really hard time, which was expected and normal. But I remember the day I was talking, we talk even to this day, we talk every Sunday. And my mom said, just want to let you know, I signed up with a couple of friends of mine and we're going on a tour, a bus tour somewhere. I don't remember where it was. And I went, really, when is that? Well, it's a couple of months from now, but we've signed up and I put my deposit down. And I went, Mom is starting to move forward because she suddenly has this vision of this trip that she's going to take that's a couple of months off. And I would say that a month prior to that, she would have said, no, I could never do that, not without your father. And so she started to make that move. So we need a vision of a positive possibility, something that draws us into the future. That's more than just, I want the pain of this to be over. The F stands for first steps. You can have great desire, you can have a fantastic vision, but if you don't know what the first step is, you'll never get to the last one. And frequently when I work with congregations, we kind of start with the vision, and then we work backwards to say, okay, if this is the vision that's pulling you, what's the thing you have to do right before that, and before that, and before that, and before that? What is the very first thing you need? One of my, I don't think I have that. No, I don't. One of my colleagues, Bishop, she's retired now, used to say that her one prayer was, "Dear Lord, give me enough light to see the next step. Give me enough light just to see the next step. We need to know where the first step is." Now I've added a corollary. "Dear Lord, please give me enough light to see the next step, and I pray that it's not a cliff." So, because we really don't want to step off a cliff into the abyss. But if we don't have some sense of what the first step, and the trouble is so often when we try to initiate change in the faith community, ray on visions, but nobody can figure out how to take the first step, and so the whole thing breaks down. And so you want to take baby steps. You want to take little bites as you move toward the vision of the future that's emerging. And again, remember that even as you're taking those first steps, there are still going to be some in the community that are dealing with grief and loss, that there's some who are still working through the pain of that loss. People are going to be in lots and lots of different places, which is why just taking the first step is so important. The S stands for sustainability. It's important to, as if you're trying to make a change, to think about how is this change going to be sustained over time? How are we going to support this vision? And I'm not just talking about money, which that's part of it. I've had all sorts of visions but didn't have the money to make them happen. But other kinds of sustainability issues, like, do we have, are people committed, to work toward this? Do we have other resources that we can use? What are our assets for maintaining this change or even initiating it? Because if we can't keep it going, it's going to be really hard. It will zero out everything else. You can have all the desire in the world. You can have the greatest vision. You could even know what you need to do tomorrow. But if you can't figure out how to keep it going, keep that energy sustained over the long haul to the point where, you move into that future, it's going to zero out the whole thing. So those are the four kind of components that you need in place if you're going to make some change. Then we go to the other side, and that is resistance. And I could spend a lot of time talking resistance. We don't probably have a lot of time to do that today. But resistance comes in a lot of different forms. It can be external. There can be forces in the world around you outside of your faith community. Because remember, a lot of times when your community is experiencing, say, decline or some other forms of loss, it may be that the community around you is experiencing those things too. And if the community around you, the extended community, your city, your town, your rural community, if the grief is intense there, even if your community of faith has kind of started to work through this stuff, they might run into all sorts of roadblocks as they step out of their faith, your faith community, and into a community that's still wrestling with sense of grief, of loss, and other kinds of things. So sometimes the resistance is external. Frequently, there's going to be internal resistance, and that comes in a whole variety of forms, from people who just don't feel like they have enough information, to those for whom the proposed change, the new thing you're trying, collides with some of their core values as people. If it's a matter of information, the need for more information, that can be pretty easily addressed. If it has to do with more value level kinds of resistance, that becomes much more problematic and much more challenging to deal with. And frequently, when the resistance is at that level, people will walk away because it's really, really hard for us to change our core values. I mean, it can be done. And I've seen this where pastors have come in to communities and the pastor, because we didn't do a good enough job in working this stuff out before the pastor took the call, sometimes the pastor's core values and the congregation's core values just don't work together, don't mesh together well. And frequently that means that the ministry, the call ends, and the pastor needs to move on to someplace else. Or a lot of people start leaving the congregation, and that triggers a bunch of other problems. So it's part of identifying and thinking about resistance is, where is it coming from and at what level is it? Is it that people are still grieving and they're really not ready to step into this new future? You know, because sometimes we don't read the situation correctly, and that's okay. We need to back up. And we could talk a lot about how you do that. I know when in the congregation, yes.
There is a comment about that. Beth says she heard a church member state, "I would rather dissolve as a congregation than change." Does that sound like resistance?
Yeah. In fact, I had a congregation. Are we? I've had that same experience. I was in a meeting, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, and somebody stood up and said, "I'd rather see this church closed than change." And my first thought was, that'd be kind of a big change, but yeah, sometimes that's some pretty intense resistance. And I knew we were in real trouble in that congregation when absolutely nobody else in the room stood up and said, no, you're wrong. Nobody really said anything, and I thought, okay, if that goes unchallenged, we're in trouble here. We're not going to get anywhere in charting a new direction in this congregation. And sadly, that congregation closed less than a year, a little bit more than a year later, I guess it was. But so yeah, that's a great comment. There's nothing rational about this sometimes. I mean, it's like, do you hear what you said? So because so often it deals at a non-rational level, at the level of emotion, sometimes in psychological places that people aren't even aware of. So, and of course, when we experience threat or something we perceive as threat, it's that kind of reptilian part of our brain that takes over, and that's totally not rational, and it doesn't function at the level of logic. And so we need to get people out of their reptilian minds and back up into their more thinking parts of their minds, and that can take some time and some patience. Thank you for that. And then at the deepest level, there could be systemic resistance, things within the systems that the congregation lives with that create barriers to change. And they can be the hardest to overcome, I think, because they're often invisible. We don't necessarily see them until we begin to look at them very closely. We talked about how congregations have systems for dealing with grief and loss, complex systems, but there are lots of other systems going on and working in the context of a faith community. And I know in our particular denomination, we're talking about that right now, is what are those systemic things that perpetuate the fact that the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is one of, if not the whitest denomination in the United States right now, which we find is a huge source of embarrassment, considering we've been working at diversity and anti-racism work for 30 years. And it doesn't seem to have put a dent in how white our congregations are. And we're starting to say, maybe the problem isn't at the surface, maybe the problem's in the system. And there are barriers there that we can't see, that we need to see. And so that's a conversation that's going on in our own church right now as we wrestle with questions of diversity and inclusion and equity. So sometimes those systemic, you scratch your head and say, why doesn't change happen? Why doesn't change happen? Why doesn't change happen? We're trying all this stuff, nothing's happening. Sometimes it's at the systemic level. And those are really hard to kind of come to grasp. It's kind of like a fish trying to, the old fish in the water analogy. We swim in those systems, and sometimes they're totally unaware of them. And so you have to be able to overcome those resistances, or at least minimize them to the point that the desire and the other components of change outweigh the resistance. Because I don't know if you ever get rid of resistance in the midst of change at all. And to remember what we said from the very outset, any change is going to generate new grief. Any change is going to generate more grief that needs to be worked through, named, confronted, dealt with, which is why these are tasks and not simple steps. Anytime change comes, even little ones, you're going to have at least some level of grief in the system that has to be worked through. Oh. Okay, I actually did have these slides in here. It's funny, I just looked at these all last night. So this is kind of a review of what we've just been talking about. People resist change when they feel they have insufficient knowledge about the proposed change and its implications. Sometimes it's the insufficient knowledge about implications that get people resistant because they don't know what it means. So you have to deal not only with the technical realities of the change, but also some of the other deeper lying kinds of implications of what change means. They believe they haven't been given enough time to understand and commit to the change. I know when we've done change, I usually try to identify those people who are likely to be the most resistant to take them out for coffee or some other beverage. But you know, sit them down and say, hey, we're thinking about this, you know, what do you think about it? And they say, I don't like the idea. Well, help me understand why you don't like the idea. Let's spend some time together, and so I can really hear where you're coming from and try to understand that, because my general assumption is if one person's opposed to the change, there are probably others. Of course, I also get really irritated when I see, well, a lot of people are saying, Pastor. It's like, who are these a lot of people? And can I know who they are so we can visit with them and hear what they have to say? Well, it's just a lot of people. Okay, tell me what you're really thinking. Which is why when we do this work, we like to use one-on-ones. Tell people, just speak for yourself. Don't speak for a lot of people. Just speak for where you're at, what you're struggling with, so that we can hear that clearly. They might believe that change is really not in the best interest of the faith community, and you need to kind of get at the root of that. They may lack trust in those who are promoting or driving the change. That's why I think it's some colleagues, pastors that I know, kind of believe that if you go into a congregation, make changes quickly, while you still have some still the honeymoon period is happening. Although I think there's been congregations have been dealing with so much, at least in our tradition, that the honeymoon for most new pastors lasts about 45 minutes. But I think change is easier done if there is, in fact, some relationship of trust, that there's been something done to establish trust. And I think that is done by going and listening to the stories of the people, listening to what's important to them, with genuine interest in who they are, where they've been, and where they've come from, to acknowledge their losses and to listen to their stories of grief. And when people feel listened to, cared for, and cared about, they're going to be much more open, not only to change, but also to talking about their concerns about that change, so that those issues can be addressed. And you know, I've had those conversations with people who were opposed to a change, and sometimes their concerns are legitimate. And I've gone, oh yeah, I guess we haven't thought about that. We need to go back and think that through. Or, oh, you're right. I think that maybe we do need to take a little bit more time to address this or that. Rather than discounting the naysayers, to try to understand who they are, where they're coming from, so that if there are barriers there that you're not seeing as a leader, they can be addressed. Or you can help the person see that the barrier that they think is there really isn't there. But more often, you just want to take those things seriously. So building trust is extremely important in this process. They may be fear that they won't be able to adapt to the change and won't have a place in the faith community anymore, and that the change will leave them out, and which of course generates its own grief. You know, I just won't belong here anymore. I won't fit. I will no longer you know, and that can be wrapped up in yearning. It can be wrapped up in a desire to maintain a status quo that really no longer exists. But it's a fear that's real, and it can't be discounted. They may believe they'll lose something of value in the change: status, belonging, competence. Those two things are related. And this is the value one that I talked about. They may feel their theology, values, or core principles are being compromised, and that's tough, because those things are so central to our own self-identities. And sometimes that means we need to agree to disagree or to part company. It breaks my heart. Sometimes somebody has said to me in a community, I just don't think I can be here anymore, Pastor. And it tears my heart out. But then I move over to, I'm really sorry you're feeling that way. I hope maybe we can work through that. But if not, let me help you find a place where you really can feel at home. And I've done that with people. So and some have even come back and said thank you. Okay, one or two. But anyway, but those resistance at that level is really difficult. Not impossible, but difficult, because, well, at least I believe that all things are possible with God. Even change hearts and values and such. I boil all this down to what I call the 4 F's of resistance. And usually one of these or all of them are at play when there's resistance in the system. Fear, fatigue, just exhaustion. We have a lot of fatigue in the system right now, at least in the systems I work with. People are just worn out. Although, like I said at the beginning, we're starting to see a little bit of that energy coming back in places. People are signing up for things and re-engaging. So we're getting past the fatigue factor a little bit. I'm hopeful. Fondness, we talked about that. We just love the way things are, which makes change hard. Or finances, we just don't have the money to do this, or the other kinds of resources. So other things that can get in the way: distance, location, lack of resources, scarcity thinking. We have a lot of that in our churches, looking at what we don't have instead of what we do have. Disruption, we've talked about a lot. Turning inward or scattering outward, I guess. Lack of participation in scheduling issues can all get in the way of initiating and moving toward this future that we're being called into. So what do we do about all that? We talked a little bit last time about technical, I think it was last time, about technical and adaptive change. Frequently we go into problem solving mode when we're facing, when we focus on deficits, on what we don't have, on what we, on the shortcomings, on where the gaps are, on where things are broken. You know, we want to get out our pipe wrench and approach this in a technical kind of a way. So the way problem solving works, you know this, because this is the way 90% of us function 90% of the time. Maybe you don't, but I think a lot of people, this is the way we function. We identify a need. We feel the need, we identify the problem. Then we analyze the problem. What do we need to do to fix it? You know, do we need a new program? Do we need to bring a new leader? Do we need to, you know, expand the staff? Do we need to get a different Sunday school program that'll draw more kids? Do we need to get a better worship band, you know, or a worship band? Do we need to put up screens? You know, I mean, how are we going to fix this problem, whatever the problem happens to be? Maybe we need to build a gym. I had somebody tell me that. I said, where are you going to do that? Well, we don't know. Our property is not big enough. But anyway, we analyze the problem, and then we look at all these possible solutions, always technical. And then we come up with an action plan, treatment. You know, means we go to the doctor and they say, well, if you take this medicine, you'll be better. If you have surgery, we come up with a treatment plan. And then we wonder why it doesn't work. And so then we go back to one. We analyze the problem, we come up with another solution, we try another solution. When in fact, what we're dealing with is adaptive issues that may not be best respond to problem-solving methods. So instead, I've been doing more and more work with congregations on strength building or asset-based approaches which instead of focusing on deficits, focused on what's there. Let's start with what we've got and figure out how to build on that, rather than trying to fill gaps and fix problems and replace things that are lost. So how does building on strengths work? Keeping an eye on time here. It starts by appreciating. This is why it's called appreciative inquiry. It's about appreciating what is, evaluating the best of what is. It starts by asking, what are those things that make us who we are, those core values that are the best of who we are. Because sometimes we have core values that are getting away. We talked about that already a little bit. But what are those drivers, those things that are at the core of who we are that we can perhaps build on? So once we start to appreciate what we have, what we can draw from the past, where are those nostalgic memories? The way I told the story at the end, that sense that in the past we've been able to work together. Now we need to work together again. And if we did it before, we can do it again. So then we begin to imagine what might be. How might we use the resources that we already have in this community of faith? And how might we create a vision for how we might put that to work? So rather than trying to be the church of 500, we used to be, how can we be the best congregation of 50 that we are now? And how might we do ministry with the resource that we actually have? I tell congregations all the time, your biggest resource right now is your building. And yeah, it may be an albatross around your neck. That may be true, but it's probably the biggest asset you got to work with. How are you going to use it for ministry now? But even the bigger asset is the people who gather here. Think about who you've got, what their gifts are, what their passions are, and how you might put those passions to work in doing ministry, not only in your community, but in the community around you. Imagine what might be. Dialogue, exploring what could be. This is where you do the talking, where you get those people together and start kicking ideas around for how that might happen. That's where you start imagining what are those first steps that you need to take. And then innovating, living into that vision, experimenting, trying new things, learning from your mistakes, and then imagining something new and building something, experimenting with something new. And particularly in our smallest congregations that I work with, a lot of times they're afraid of trying stuff because the fear is if we try something and it fails, we're done. And that's not necessarily wrong. Because, if you're kind of hanging on by a thread anyway, might not take much to be the difference between continuing ministry and closing. And that's hard. But I say, okay, then you need to maybe dream and experiment smaller. Get the dream and the vision and the first steps in line with who you are and what you are. So you're probably not going to be able to hire a youth director. You just don't have the resource to do that. You might not even be able to call a pastor at this point. But what can the 10 of you do that can start to engage people in your community in a new way? And people can get really creative and do things that really don't cost a whole lot. And they can, so you want more youth in your church because you're all, senior citizens. Well, you're probably not going to create a big, huge youth program like after school program. What if you go to the schools and start volunteering for a reading program? I mean, that doesn't cost anything. What if you figure out where parents are? And I've said to several people, so how many of you are good grandparents? And usually everybody raises their hands. Not everybody, but most everybody raises their hand. So figure out a way to use your grandparenting skills. Are there families in your community who are far away from their elders? How can you create a way to be good grandparents to the families in your community? That's just one idea, and there are others. And again, simple, easy, first step that doesn't require a lot of resource. And I had one congregation that did reach out to local school and started to do some of the reading program. And then it got all messed up with schedules and stuff. And they finally said, well, this kind of isn't working. So they backed off. Congregation didn't collapse. And then they tried some other things. So it's, you got to think in small packages when the resources are not great, rather than coming up with this grand vision, and that there's no way that you could possibly. So we got about 10 minutes. So why does this work? Why does this more appreciative way of approaching things, building on strengths, work? Before we begin to wrap this up for time. It creates context in which all people in the community are free to be known in the context of relationship, because one of the cores, oh, this is still all in AI language. I didn't get that all changed. Appreciative inquiry works because part of that is talking to people individually and one-on-ones and creating spaces for people to get together, to have these conversations, to dialogue, to dream together, rather than one person coming up with an idea and then trying to convince everybody else. Coming up with an idea is how to fix things and then try to get everybody else on board. Creates space where people really are free to be heard. It opens up an opportunity for people to dream together and imagine together. And believe me, when you get a congregation, a community of faith dreaming together, it creates its own energy. It creates its own energy. People start to get excited because it's their dream and their vision, and it starts to bubble up. And again, the reminder is that this is after we've done some grief work. If we've done, dealt with some of those senses of loss, where people are starting to be willing and able to dream a little bit, to imagine that they really could go on a bus trip, and then dream together about where they might go. It establishes an environment where people are free to choose to contribute. So people will get engaged at the level in which they feel called to get engaged. Other people are going to hang back and listen, and that's okay. The resistance will still be there, but if you're in relationship with people, you can sit down and think about what that's about. Provide the context for people to be free to act with support. I had a rule in the congregations that I serve that if you had a great idea, if you could find 2 other people that thought it was a good idea too, I would support you in the best way that I could. And we had a lot of great experiments happen that way. My other theory was, if you can't convince 2 other people in this congregation to work with you on this, it's probably not the right time, or it's just not it's not as good an idea as it sounds. But man, if you can convince 2 other people to join you in this experiment in ministry, and I still do that even as bishop. When people say, Bishop, you should, I say, okay. You have 2 other people, I'll be very happy to support you in that. And we've launched some cool stuff even in our synod, doing things that way, to invite people to dream and act together and support one another. And it opens the way for people to be positive, to build on what is positive rather than always focus on the deficits and where the problems are. But you can't really do that until you deal with the grief. So I'm going to zip through some of this. Because we're coming close to the end. I want to give at least a few minutes to for some conversation. So we're going to just walk through this here really quick. There are 5 core processes in appreciative inquiry in doing this strength-based building and creating. It focuses on the positive. It's about inquiring into the stories of the life-giving forces in the faith community. That's tapping into those nostalgic memories. It locates themes that appear in those stories and then pulls out topics for further inquiry. It's about sharing images for that preferred future and then finding innovative ways to create that future together in small steps. Okay. I believe that all faith communities really have 2 choices. The first choice is to die. To keep doing what you're doing, to continue to decline, and to eventually close your doors and distribute your assets, or to die, to let go of the yearning for the past, to draw the strengths and what is best out of your nostalgic stories, including those nostalgic stories of faith that we find in Scripture, and then to die to what has been and to look forward, carrying forward those memories to the new life that lies ahead. And so I think at least the churches I work with are really at that point. They either need to keep doing what they're doing and plan for the funeral. And we've helped congregations do that, and it's not been a bad thing. Or they need to embrace this new future that God is calling them, which is going to be letting those things, but so that you might find a new place for those things in your heart and move forward. And when you get to that point, you begin to take up life again. I think that's always the goal. And this isn't this is not a one-stop or one kind of process. It's an ongoing way of looking at life, at ministry, and of what we're called to do and to be as communities of faith in the world. And so the tasks of grieving are always there in any faith community system. We're always dealing with loss. We're always dealing with change. We're always dealing with adapting to what's going on in the world around us and finding new ways to take up life. And so it's not, you do this once and you're done. It's an ongoing way of looking at the world that looks at blessing and at the blessings that we have, how to build on them, and to grieve those things that we lost. So I'm going to stop there. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, and we'll see where we go from there.
We would invite all of you to ask any questions or make comments in the question box. Also, I would suggest that if you have any particular topics that you want to discuss next week during the bonus session, that you might want to put those in the question box as well. You might want to indicate by putting the word bonus in front of that if you have any particular things that need a little bit more conversation next week. Be sure to put those in the question box. We have an affirmation here, Bishop Mike, that says amen to that from Teresa. So I'm not exactly sure what she was amening, but we have a good reflection there on what you're saying. It strikes me, we've talked about these themes for a number of years, you and I just am always struck by how it seems you're taking a model that many therapists would use in individual or family therapy, and you're applying those principles to the congregation. And I'm especially noticing those that positive core conversation that you went and talked us through earlier as that positive self-referencing belief that we oftentimes will use. What do I want to believe about myself versus the negative self-referencing belief, and how that is rock solid good stuff in terms of therapy. I would ask you this one question. Is it helpful, who leads the process? Is it helpful to have the faith leader, the primary assigned faith leader in that congregation lead this process, or is it more helpful to have someone come from the outside? How do we know the difference?
Generally with appreciative inquiry, I'm just starting with a congregation around an appreciative inquiry process, and I guess I'm meeting with them first time next month. The faith community leader is usually not the leader of that process, because the community needs to do that work. Really, that doesn't mean they're not involved. But we start with by developing a core team. My general approach is usually the first conversation I have is with the faith leader if the congregation has one. But second, I go and I talk with the council, the board, whoever the lay leaders are, and we lay out the process a little more detailed than what I just did now. And then the council then forms a core team, and then they really lead the process in the life of the congregation. I believe that working with consultants is a good thing. My father used to say an expert is anybody that's more than 50 miles from home. Because sometimes bringing somebody in from the outside, who can say things and do things in ways that the people in the community, whether it's the faith leader or the lay leaders, just can't say, or can't say in a way that's been listened to. I've gone into more than one congregation, even as bishop, and said something in a session, and everybody goes, yeah, that's really good. That's a great idea. And I walk out in the hall afterwards, and the faith leader the pastor says to me, I've been telling them that for 3 years, and they haven't heard a word of it. So sometimes bringing somebody in from the outside really is helpful, because they can say, plus, because I and some of my people that I work with, have worked with a particularly appreciative inquiry, but this kind of strength-based approach. We've got practice, we've got history, we've done the reading, we know something about it, and we do bring in expertise that the faith leader, with all of their other responsibilities and duties, probably doesn't have time to kind of get up to speed on. So,
thank you for that.
The same reason that individuals need to go to therapists sometimes.
Sometimes someone else can be heard more clearly, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, well, we have come to the close of our session and our regular webinars. I want to say a personal word of thanks to Church World Service for inviting me to be a part of this process, especially to Rebecca Belays, Matt Stevens, and Heather Wilson. I know all of you want to say a huge thank you to Bishop Mike. What an incredible job you have done for us. Thank you so much for giving us your time to help us learn how to work within our faith communities more effectively. Reminder to all of you to watch your emails for information about the bonus session. Go to the webinar hub for all things webinar. And I want to say also a thank you to all of you who have attended and been a part of this process with us in this journey. So hope to see you next week.
See you next week.